Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. Friends, have you ever wondered how terrorists get their advanced weapons? The answer might surprise you, and it's more complex than you think. Welcome to our deep dive into a shadow world of the global arms trades. The global arms trades is a multi-billion-dollar industry. In the 2020 alone, it was valued at over $531 billion. But how does this massive industry work? Let's start with the basic. There are two main types of the arms trades, legal and the illegal. Where the legal arms trades are conducted between governments and the authorized dealers. These deals are supposed to be carefully regulated and monitored. However, the line between legal and the illegal can often blur. Here is where things get complicated. Many weapons that end up in the hands of the terrorists start in the completely legal transactions. How does this happen? There are several ways. First, let's talk about state sponsorship. Some countries actively support terrorist groups as a part of their foreign policy. This might provide weapons directly or funnel them through intermediaries. This has happened in the conflict across Middle East and Africa. Next, we have the problem of a weak regulation and the corruption. In some countries, it's easy for arms dealers to forge documentation or bribe officials. This allows them to divert weapons from their intended recipients. Well, these weapons can then be sold on a black market. Speaking of the black market, is a major player in this story. The black market for weapons is estimated to be over $1 billion annually. It operates in the shadow, connecting buyers and the sellers across borders. Often, these transactions involve weapons stolen from government stockpiles or battlefield. Now, let's discuss the world of lobbying and the weapon industry. It is a topic that affects us all, whether we realize it or not. Let's start by understanding what lobbying actually is. Well, the lobbying is a practice of trying to persuade government officials to support certain policies. In the case of the weapon industry, companies hire lobbyists to promote their interests. These lobbyists work to influence lawmakers and the government agencies. Their goal is to create policies that benefit weapon manufacturers. Now, let's look at some numbers to grasp the scale of this influence. In 2022, the US weapon industry spent over $100 billion lobbying efforts. That's a lot of money dedicated to swaying political decisions. But why do they spend so much? Simply put, it's an investment that pays off big time. Let's break down how this lobbying works. Weapon industry lobbyists often build relationships with the key politicians. They attend fundraisers, make campaign contributions, and organize events. Well, these actions help them to gain access to decision makers. Once they have this access, they can present their case directly to those in the power. One common tactic is to frame weapon production as a job creator. Lobbyists argue that supporting the weapon industry means supporting American workers. They highlight how many jobs are tied to weapon manufacturing in the various states. This approach makes it harder for politicians to oppose a weapon-friendly policy. Now, let's move on to the world of war profiting. First, let's define what we mean by war profiting. It's a practice of making excessive profit from war or conflict. This can involve selling weapons, providing services, or rebuilding after destruction. Throughout history, war profiting has been a constant presence. From ancient time to the modern conflict, some have always found ways to profit. Now, let's look at some of the biggest players in this industry. One of the most well-known is Lockheed Martin. They are the world's largest defense contractors. In the 2020, they reported net sales of $65 billion. Their products, including fighter jets, missiles, and the radar systems. Another major company is Raytheon Technologies. They specialize in the aerospace and the defense technologies. Their revenue in 2020 was $56 billion. Raytheon products produces missiles, drones, and the cyber security systems. Boeing is another name you might recognize. While known for their commercial aircrafts, they have a significant defense division. In 2020, their defense segment brought in $26 billion. They make fighter jets, helicopters, and the satellite systems. Now, let's talk about how these companies make their money. The government contracts are a primary source of the income. The US Department of the Defense award billions in the contract each year. In 2020, the Pentagon's budget was $721 billion. A significant portion of this goes to defense contractors. But it's not just the US government buying this product. Many of these companies sell to other countries as well. This is called the international arms trade. It is a controversial practice, often criticized by the human rights groups. Let's look at some specific example of war profiting. During the Iraq War, Halliburton made headlines. They received billions in the no-bid contracts for services in the Iraq. This included everything from feeding troops to rebuilding oil fields. The company's former CEO was Vice President Dick Cheney. This led to the acquisition of the conflict of interest. Another example is Eric Prince, founder of Blackwater. Blackwater provided private security services in Iraq and Afghanistan. They made millions from government contracts. However, they face criticism for their action in the conflict zones. But it's important to note that war profiting isn't always about weapons. Some companies profit from reconstruction efforts. After a conflict, there are often a need of a rebuild infrastructure. This can include roads, bridges, and the government buildings. But the companies that specialize in the construction can make significant profit. Now, let's discuss the ethical concerns surrounding war profiting. Critics argue that these companies have a vested interest in the conflict. They say this could influence foreign policy decisions. There is also concern about revolving doors between government and the industry. Many former government officials end up working for defense contractors. Supporters argue that these companies provide necessary services. They say their products also protect soldiers and the civilians. They also point to the job created by the defense industry. Let's look at some attempt to regulate war profiting. In the US, there are laws against excessive profit from the war contract. The Truth in the Negotiation Act requires contractors to disclose their cost data. The Foreign Corrupt Practice Act prohibits bribing foreign officials. Internationally, there are efforts to control the arms trades. The Arms Trade Treaty aims to regulate international arms sales. However, not all countries have signed or ratified this treaty. Now, let's talk about autonomous weapons, or as some call them, as a killer robot. These aren't your typical movie villains. We are talking about real machines that could make life or death decision on their own. Let's start with the basic. What exactly are autonomous weapons? Simply put, they are military systems that can select and engage target without human intervention. Imagine a drone that can fly itself, identify enemy combatants, and decide whether to attack all its own. Sound impressive, right? But it's also pretty concerning when you think about it. Now, you might be wondering, why would anyone want to create such weapons? Well, there are a few arguments in favor of autonomous weapons. First, they could potentially reduce human casualties on the battlefield. Machines don't get tired, scared, or emotional, which might lead to a fewer mistake. They could also react much faster than humans in the critical situation. But here is where things get tricky. Just because a machine can make a decision quickly doesn't mean it will always make the right one. War is complex with many shades of the gray. Can a robot truly understand the context of a situation? Can it distinguish between a civilian and a combatant in a confusing, chaotic environment? Let's look at a hypothetical situation. Imagine an autonomous tank patrolling a war-torn city. It detects a movement in a building and identifies what it thinks is an enemy weapon. But what if it's a child carrying a toy gun? A human soldier might be able to make that distinction, but could a machine do that? This brings us to one of the biggest ethical concerns, accountability. If an autonomous weapons make a mistake and harm civilians, who is responsible? The programmer, the manufacturers, the military commanders who deployed it? It's a legal and a moral minefield that we are only beginning to navigate. Now, let's move on to the complex world of the private military contractors. With the private military contractors, or PMCs, have become a significant part of modern warfare. But what exactly are they? Simply put, PMC are private companies that provide military and the security services. These services can range from logistic and the training to actual combat operations. The use of PMCs has grown dramatically since the early 2000s. This growth was particularly noticeable during the war in the Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's look at some numbers to understand the scale of PMC involvement. In 2016, the US military had about 26,000 contractors in the Afghanistan. This was compared to about 9,800 US troops. In other words, contractors outnumbered traditional soldiers by almost 3 to 1. So, why do governments and the organization hire PMCs? Well, there are several reasons for this trend. First, PMC offer flexibility. They can be deployed quickly without the need for lengthy political processes. Second, they can provide specialized skill that might be lacking in the regular forces. Third, using PMCs can help keep official casualties numbers down. This can be politically advantageous for the government. However, the use of the PMC is not without controversy. One major issue is accountability. PMC operates in the legal gray area, often beyond the reach of the military law. This can lead to the problem when contractors commit crime or human rights abuses. A notorious example is the Nisour Square massacre in the Iraq in 2007. Employees of the PMC Blackwater killed 17 Iraqi civilians in the Baghdad. This incident sparked outrages and raised questions about PMC's oversight. Another concern is the potential for conflict of the interest. PMCs are profit-driven entities. Critics argue that this could lead to prolonged conflict or unnecessary intervention. After all, war is their business. Let's take a closer look at some of the largest PMC in the world. G4S, based in the UK, is one of the biggest. They employ over 500,000 people worldwide. Another major player is Dycroft International, based in the United States. They have been involved in everything from the drug eradication in the Colombia to police training in the Iraq. But it's not just Western countries that use PMCs. Russia also has embraced this trend. The Wagner Group, a Russian PMC, has been active in the Syria, Libya, and the several African countries. Their operations often align closely with the Russian foreign policy objectives. PMCs don't just operate in the war zone, they also involve in the anti-piracy operation, protecting ships in the dangerous water. Some PMCs provide security for humanitarian operations in an unstable region. Others train local forces in the counter-terrorism tactic. Now, let's talk about the world of arms race and how they affect global tension. Let's start with a simple question. What is an arms race? It's when countries compete to have the most advanced and the powerful weapons. Think of it like a never-ending game of one-upmanship, but with a serious consequences. The history of arms race goes back centuries. Remember the naval arms race between Britain and Germany before World War I? That's the classic example of how weapons competition can lead to the conflict. But why do countries engage in the arms race? Often, it's about fear and the mistrust between nations. When one country develops new weapons, others feel threatened. They respond by developing their weapons, and the cycle continues. Now, let's talk about the weapon industry's role in all this. Well, the weapon manufacturers are businesses, and like any businesses, they want to make profit. They invest in the research and the development to create new, more advanced weapons. Then they sell these weapons to governments around the world. Here is where it gets interesting. The weapon industry often lobbies government to increase military spending. They argue that the new weapons are necessary for national security. This creates a cycle where more money is spent on the weapons, fueling the arms race. Let's look at some numbers to put this in a perspective. In the 2020, global military spending reached almost 2 trillion. That's a lot of money gaining into weapons, into the military equipments. But it's not just about the money. Arms race have real consequences for global tension. When countries stockpile weapons, it can make their neighbors nervous. This tension can lead to conflicts or even wars. Take the Cold War for example. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in the nuclear arms race for decades. This led to a period of the intense global tension known as the Cold War. Even today, nuclear weapons remain a source of international concern. So, how does this affect ordinary people like us? Well, money spent on the weapons is money not spent on other things. This could mean less funding for education, healthcare, or infrastructure. It also means living in the world where the threat of the conflict is always present. Now, let's talk about how the weapon industry support repressive regimes. This is a story of profit, power, and the human right violation that affects millions of the people globally. The weapon industry is a multi-billion-dollar business. Companies in these sectors produce everything from the small arms stands to the fighter jets. But who are their customers? While many legitimate governments purchases weapons for national defense, some buyers have more sinister intentions. But how do these sales happen in the first place? Many countries have a law and the regulation to prevent weapons from falling into the wrong hand. However, there are often loopholes and the workarounds. Now, let's move on to the environmental impact of weapon manufacturing and the testing. Let's start with the basics. What exactly goes into making weapons? The process involves extracting raw material, processing them, and assembling the final product. Each step has its environmental footprint. First, let's look at material extraction. Mining for metals like iron, copper, and the aluminium is a major source of the pollution. It often leads to deformation, soil erosion, and water contamination. For example, in the Dominican Republic of the Congo, mining for coltan used in the electronic weapons has devastated local ecosystem. Next, we have the manufacturing processes itself. Weapons factories consume enormous amount of the energy, contributing to greenhouse gas emission. They also produce hazardous waste, including toxic chemicals and the heavy metals. These pollutants can seep into the soil and the water, harming local communities and the wildlife. But it doesn't stop there. What about weapon testing? Take the Nevada test site in the US, where nuclear weapons were tested during the Cold War. The area remains contaminated with the radioactive materials to this day. Now, let's explore the black market for weapons. The legal arms trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It operates in the shadow, away from the public view and the legal oversight. But its effects are felt worldwide, fueling conflict and the violence. Let's start by understanding what we mean by illegal arms. These can range from a small firearm to heavy military equipments. Handguns, assault rifles, and even missiles fall in this category. Any weapon sold or transported without proper authorization is considered illegal. So, where do these weapons come from? Well, there are several sources, each playing a role in this complex network. First, we have weapons stolen from legitimate sources. Military bases, police stations, and even gun shops can be targeted. In 2016, a US military base in Germany reported the theft of several assault rifles and the pistols. These weapons likely ended up in the black market. Next, we have weapons diverted from the legal shipments. Corrupt officials or middlemen might lose a part of a legitimate arms shipment. These lost weapons then find their ways into illegal channels. Then there is the issue of surplus weapons from past conflicts. After war ends, not all weapons are properly accounted for or destroyed. These leftover arms become prime targets for arms dealers. The fall of the Soviet Union, for example, led to the flood of weaponing entering the black market. Now, let's talk about how these weapons move around the globe. Armed traffickers use complex routes to avoid detections. They might ship weapons in the parts distinguished as other goods. Sometimes they use multiple countries as a transit point to confuse authorities. A real-world example of this is a case of Victor Bot, known as the Merchant of Death. Bot used a network of the shell companies and the cargo planes to move weapons globally. He supplies arms to conflict in Africa, Asia, and the South America for years before his arrest. But who buy these illegal weapons? The customers are as varied as the sources. Terrorist groups often rely on the black market to arm themselves. Criminal organizations use these weapons to protect their illegal activities. Even some governments turn to the black market when faced with the armed embargoes. The impact of this trade is devastating. Illegal weapon fuels civil war, making them longer and deadlier. The market for weapons continues to thrive in the shadows, but with awareness, cooperation, and the determined action, we can hope to curb its deadly impact. What are your thoughts on this issue? Share your views in the comments below. If you found this video informative, please like and share with others. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth look at global issues. Thank you for watching, and remember, knowledge is the first step towards change.